today we're going to be talking about racial diversity in clinical trials. Much of what we're talking about applies to many other forms of diversity, particularly as it relates to systems of historic and ongoing oppression. But I just want to be explicit that most of the research that grounds this presentation is based in studies on racial diversity. The way that I see systems of oppression operating in the world is they're always sort of like intersectional and interconnecting. And so, that's why while this much of this may apply to other axes of oppression and diversity. Well, actually, before I go through the agenda, I'll say that, the part of why we're doing this training is because the center that I'm at, the Feminist Research Institute, we really deeply believe that there needs to be a transformation in the way we do research and how we do research. And part of how we want to see this happening is by helping people to have new intellectual tools to ask different questions that really take into account the impact of historic and ongoing systems of oppression. Because the fact is that pretty much virtually every field of research has some history in white supremacy, colonialism, and patriarchy. That's just like a historic fact. And I talked more about that in the last session if you were there. And so, part of what we're really doing here is just looking at how does this apply in the very specific case of clinical trials, because obviously clinical trials are incredibly important. And so today, first, we're going to give some background information, just kind of like, making sure we're all on the same page and understanding at least where we're all coming from in relationship to the topic at hand of clinical trials. Then we're going to talk about this framing, or this reframing that we'll be looking at of moving from a sort of implicit logic of thinking in terms of individual deficit. In other words, in deficits within an individual or community that we are like seeking somehow to bring into clinical trials, to systemic deficits that instead it's like, people aren't staying out where there's things that are actually really keeping people out. We'll talk about actions that we can take, because I think it's really important that we leave here with some very clear, like, this is what you can do about this. And then you all will have a chance to engage in some discussion. And then we'll have we'll have a chance, to kind of like think about how this applies directly to your own research. And then we'll have a chance to kind of like do a little bit of sharing out, and we'll do some closing. Throughout, I'll be putting up some Zoom polls. And in fact, that's what we're going to do right now. A lot of these polls are kind of like to give us a sense of where everyone in the room is at. And so my first question is going to be, do you see clinical trials as an area of growth in your own research? So in other words, like, is this something you want to get into? And so you can just kind of, choose the option that feels most in line with, your own thoughts. And then the second question is, what is your current knowledge of clinical trials? And so I just kind of gave some options. There's obviously, I put other, because like, I'm sure there's other ways to be involved, but, maybe you've been on a team, or you've maybe been actually like, say, like, a research participant in clinical trials. That's what that second one is alluding to. Maybe you've read reports, maybe you've other experiences, or maybe this is just, something you kind of heard about, but you don't really know too much about. So it looks like I think we've got pretty much everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and share out the results here. So we can see here that 38% of you definitely see yourself working in clinical trials. And, another 38% are, not sure. It sounds like one person here is, they think that that's unlikely. And I'll add for that, I still think that a lot of this information is very applicable, because you could think of this clinical trials as a case study, but that really, the sort of underlying mechanisms that we'll be talking about are really true of many different types of research. And in terms of current knowledge, we see a lot of people have read reports on clinical trials. 2 people have already been on a team, so that's great. You'll have some really direct experience that you can contribute to the discussions. And 1 person this is new for. Okay, so thank you all for sharing your experience and expertise there. As you all, I'm sure, you all know, clinical trials is, really crucial to research. And the inclusion of diverse groups is necessary, 1, to achieve equitable health systems, and 2, to make sure that we're conducting rigorous science. Now, I'll add that, I don't see this as imperative because for necessarily a purely biological reason, because a whole lot of research has shown that race is, not sort of like a biological construct, it's a social construct, but it's a social construct with real material impacts on people's bodies. And that therefore, it is incredible, just because something, our healthcare, and our health is not just biological, it's also social, it's also cultural. And so all of these things are factors as well. And these need to be taken into account, in all forms of research. The other thing I'll say is that, a lot of you, again, probably all know this, but the later phase trial, the more benefit it tends to have for the patients. And so if a patient is participating in a phase 1, it tends to be more just the research gets the benefits, but the patient does not. And so, people may tend to have more compensation models at that phase. Whereas in say, by the time we're getting to phase 3, oftentimes the patient is seeing direct benefit in terms of, their own healthcare outcomes. Now, another assumption we're coming in with, we'll talk about, is that there is quite a bit of inequity in both historical and present structures of medical research and clinical trials. And, that's real. Essentially, we're coming in with that assumption. The reason is because there is, quite a stack of research to show us this. And, we'll be talking about that as we go. Okay, so we did a pretty, we spent a lot of time looking at the research on clinical trials, coming, really from fields that were from the medical field. I should have said this earlier. The field I'm coming from is cultural studies and science and technology studies, where I really study the interaction between systems of culture and power and systems of science and medicine and technology. And so, I'm kind of coming from over here, but, I also want to understand, what are the conversations in medicine? And so this is kind of what I saw as the conversations in medicine, is the type of barriers that people talked about. One was language. So it's kind of okay, people don't, speak English, and we don't have translations, or, and then with that language, I'd also say there's sort of this cultural kind of language differences. And which links to the next one, a lack of scientific literacy. People just don't understand what a clinical trial is. They don't understand how science works. And so, that's a problem. The next is patient non-compliance. Patients don't have the ability for some reason to follow the directions. In order for our research results to, be viable, we have to have people stick with the protocol, and patients aren't compliant with the protocol. Another barrier often discussed is mistrust. Patients don't trust that this actually could have a benefit to them. They don't see why they should participate. And so, that's a problem. How do we get their trust is often the question that's then asked. There's also seen as a lack of information, oh, patients don't know about this. So how can we just get the word out? As if we just get the word out more, this will address the problem. Some people pointed towards a bias, and I'll say these that I've listed up above, I would say all of these are kind of implicitly pointing towards the individual as the problem, the potential research participant as the problem, and somehow we have to change something related to their position to find a solution. Now, the rest that go, there's a little bit of that, but it's kind of now also looking towards the researcher and the system and what remains. There's one, people also brought up like a bias in recruitment, like maybe people aren't necessarily, there may be assumptions that certain types of patients may tend to be more non-compliant, so we're not going to even bother recruiting them. There's often jargon in the way that people talk about clinical trials. People, like a person on the street is just like, okay, I don't even understand, what you're asking for, what you're looking for, because of the research-oriented terms you're using. There's also an issue around a lack of health insurance. People who don't have health insurance or don't have robust health insurance may be less likely to access care in the first place and therefore be exposed to the opportunities in clinical trials. There's also time and economic constraints. So, people may not have time to participate in maybe like extra medical visits that may be required. There's also huge issues around transportation. Many people may struggle to even get to their appointments, let alone extra appointments that may be required for taking part in a clinical trial. If anyone has other, constraints that they can think of or barriers that they've either encountered or read about, I welcome kind of including those in the chat, and I'll kind of like bring those up as we go. And y'all are welcome, by the way, if you have like thoughts as I go, to please put them in the chat, and we'll kind of, bring that in as well. Okay, so I kind of went through like the barriers that we were seeing, and I began to kind of lay out how in it we were seeing this like tension between like, is it an individual problem or is it a systemic deficit? And we wanted to kind of, what we'll be doing is kind of showing how many challenges that we saw often framed as a problem, as an individual problem or a problem with a particular community, can be reframed as a systemic deficit. So the first one we'll look at is oftentimes people would like just the very framing of saying that racial communities are underrepresented. When we really started digging into some research, particularly honestly outside of the field of medicine, specifically looking at like anthropological studies of medicine and science and the study of science and culture, we found that actually this is not as true as people think it is. That actually what's happening is racialized communities are facing unequal risk. And to get really specific about what this means is that we found there's actually significant evidence to show that sometimes in some racialized groups may actually be overrepresented in phase 1 trials and underrepresented in subsequent phase trials. So this is, based in a book by Jill Fisher called Adverse Events, Race and Equality in the Testing of New Pharmaceuticals. And in this book, she tracks how there is actually an overrepresentation of Black and Latino men specifically in phase 1 trials. And so they're actually receiving higher risks and lower benefits to their health. So this actually troubles the narrative that, mistrust is the main barrier to recruitment. And it shows that actually, like you can get people to participate in these trials, but, it seems to be the trials that have the least benefit. Now, she pointed out that there's a sort of element of, there can be sometimes an element of, you could say like economic coercion involved. Because these phase 1s, were paid volunteers, and that's in some cases they were being largely recruited from communities where people may be in economic distress, and they're more likely to participate for the economic benefit. So that's one. So clearly, it shows that some researchers can access diverse communities, when desired. So the next problem I want to turn to is that what's often thought of as an individual problem, that communities don't trust researchers. And reframe this as a systemic deficit is the fact that there have been histories of abuse in medical research, that actually that mistrust is coming from a real place. And we need to actually acknowledge that, not just necessarily be like, oh yeah, we're not doing that anymore. Because why in the world should people believe that? What's much more helpful is actually to encounter that past, to really think about it, to really closely examine, are we really not doing this anymore? And there's a lot of great literature. I should say, actually, it's actually very unsettling and disturbing, and literature to read how we've dehumanized many people in our population, particularly Black Americans, recent migrants, people in the global South. Here's just one book that I'd recommend. It's called Medical Apartheid: The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet Washington. In this book, as well as in other books, they really there's a well-documented history of discrimination in terms of, again, who benefits and who pays the costs for the kind of medical insights and that we enjoy today. There's one quote I want to highlight. She says, "To gain trust, we must first acknowledge the flagrant abuses of the past and the subtler ones of the present." And the truth is that, these abuses are still happening, but again, they're more subtle. One example that we came across was a case of an experiment where they were recruiting siblings of incarcerated youth, or youth that had been a part of the juvenile justice system. And this was experienced by parents who had to sort of consent to their child being enrolled or not, as something that they kind of had to do in order to be in the good graces of, say, of the social workers or the other workers, that they may sort of be at their mercy, in terms of, the well-being of their incarcerated child. And so the parents would sort of be like, okay, I guess I have to have my other kid do this, because if I don't, it might impact my kid who's in juvenile lockup, and or maybe is on probation, or that sort of thing. And in this case, the very specific research questions that were being asked were really perpetuating a deficit model, kind of looking at, well, are the siblings of kids whose siblings are incarcerated more likely to perform badly in school? Are they going to be incarcerated too? Are they going to have poor outcomes? Without looking at, any sort of systemic analysis. And so essentially, it had the way that those results could be used could actually further harm those children. So again, that's just an example of a more subtle way that that research can be happening, in today. Another individual problem I'll highlight here is that people often say, oh, communities are hard to reach. And they'll specifically, say, maybe they're not, researchers may not tend to see, more low-income patients, for example. And what we saw here was, last year I said this differently, but I'm going to reframe it based on more information I've gotten this year, is if we look at think of this as a systemic deficit, we can say that where people get their primary care differs, and in those different spaces, the priorities of care differ. And so because of this, their access to, say, exposure to clinical trials is more indirect. Now, I'll be more exact about what I mean. So last year, there was this op-ed that came out in the LA Times that kind of got a lot of coverage. And it was asking, why won't UC clinics serve patients with state-funded health insurance? And, they kind of came out and they were saying that, many, 1 in 3 Californians are insured through Medi-Cal, but very few of these patients can get care through the UC healthcare system. And, hardly any of them are seen at UC clinics. UC clinics hardly ever, take Medi-Cal for primary care, as little as 1%. And, so this got a lot of people up in arms saying how are they, and then, we could say, how are they, can they possibly participate in research infrastructure if they're not even, going to our healthcare clinics? Well, the answer to that is that we have funding structures and agreements that actually sort of systemically have created that situation. And yes, the UCs are part of that, but it's, there's a bigger picture too. So, the way that in California, for example, and in many states, Medi-Cal or Medicare care patients are often seen at federally qualified healthcare clinics. Or other sort of community clinics. And this is because those clinics receive additional funding in order to serve those patients. And these are centers, that, are often very care-centric, very geared towards sort of like helping people to, raise their like kind of reach a greater state of health in a very sort of like immediate primary way, and maybe connecting them to other resources as well, and doing all sorts of amazing work. But in that space, participation in a research project is going to be pretty low on the priority list. If they only have so much time to see a patient and so many things to talk with them about, informing them about like the latest in clinical trials, probably not going to be, something they're going to make sure they make time for. Now, I will say that like many of these FQHCs, as they're called, do refer often to the UC healthcare system for specialized care referrals. That's kind of like, part of how the system works. And that is where, there is an opportunity to, in this case, say like, introduce them to clinical trials, but there's also an opportunity, to look at how can we work with these FQHCs more effectively. The next problem I want to talk about is this idea that patients are non-compliant. So, patients don't do what we want them to do. But at a systemic level, what we can look at is the ways that this process is not necessarily transparent. And there's a great example of this is some of the research. This is another book by Harriet Washington. She's just there's lots of other researchers. Her work is just like really exceptional, which is why I'm bringing it up here. Who wrote this book called Carte Blanche, The Erosion of Medical Consent. And in this, she really traces like the erosion of medical consent that is ongoing. This was just published in 2020. And what she looked at is how the way that medical consent is often being construed really centers researcher needs more than patient needs. Now, obviously, we have an IRB process that deals with this, but even in that structure, she's seen how again, the sort of lens is more like, okay, how can this research be done well, and how can we get subjects to participate? Things that this has come to allow is, one, there's more clinical trials now that are tending to be done in the global South, where in some places there may be less oversight or less attention to the processes that are actually listed out in the IRB happening on the ground. There's also a rise in what she calls assumed consent. And so this kind of means like, and this is like a lack of direct consent in trauma cases. And I mean trauma in two different senses. One is trauma if someone comes in with sort of like a trauma case that needs to be addressed directly. They may, in say the emergency room or that, they may say, okay, we're going to assume this person would consent to this treatment because it might be better. But they don't really know that. There's also issues around just people who are kind of existing in a state of trauma because of, the many ways that we encounter traumatic experiences, whether it's in our personal lives or through, like this sort of, systems of oppression and dehumanization that we live in. And consent may be asked for in a way that is not necessarily trauma informed. And so either way, consent becomes more presumed than necessarily explicitly given with transparency. So the next individual problem, and this is the last one that I'm going to talk about, is communities, this idea that communities lack scientific literacy. So sort of like this again, because if we think that's the problem, then the answer is often like education and outreach. And we just need to like, tell people how things quote unquote really work. But we can turn that around and also say that, it's very possible that scientists and researchers have some learning to do here too. And so scientists, may at times lack a sense of cultural humility. and that we, we as researchers may need to, kind of step back and look at what we can learn from communities. A great example to kind of illustrate this is there's often within research this idea of sort of like the good patient, and this kind of aligns with sort of like a compliant versus non-compliant patient. Like the patient who kind of follows the rules, does everything we want. And oftentimes that model of the good patient is actually, whether we recognize it or not, is often racialized, is often, built kind of reliant on assumptions about class and sometimes assumptions about gender. And that means that the very model that we're working under is like sort of systemically exclusive. And that if we can kind of move with more humility and more curiosity about what good health means to different people in different spaces, we actually, may be able to connect with more people. So the translation is not necessarily a one-way thing where we just tell them about science, but we learn from them where they're coming from and how they understand good health, what good health looks like. And then, we have more of a dialogue. Okay, so I just gave a whole bunch of information. And, some of this may have resonated more with you than other points. Some of the points I may made, you'd be like, I see that, but that's like, doesn't seem as big an issue. Whereas something else you may say, yes, that actually seems really important and like something that needs addressed. So the next question I'm going to ask in a poll here is, which of these aspects of systemic inequity would you like to explore further? And so this is one just so you all can see kind of like where you're all coming from. And also, so when you move into your discussions, your facilitators have a sense of, which topics we discussed are of the most interest. So the first is, just to reread them as you're making your selections: unequal distribution of risks and benefits in research. That's sort of like the difference between phase 1 to phase 3 trials. Understanding these histories of abuses in medical research. 3, these differing priorities depend, in different primary care settings of say like FQHC versus, getting your primary care at a R1 hospital or research center hospital. 4, this erosion of consent. And then finally, this lack of cultural humility on the part of researchers. Okay, I am going to go ahead and close out this poll now. I think we have everyone, and I'll share out the results so you all can see where you're at. And so we see 6 out of 9 of you are, find this question of like differing priorities really interesting. And I think that's great because there we're really talking about sort of like on the ground, what's really happening in the world. 4 of you are interested in this question of erosion of consent. That's really great because that's another place where we can kind of make direct interventions. 3 are interested in, respectively, the unequal distribution of risks and benefits and these histories of abuses, which are, obviously connected. And then, 2 of you interested in this question of like cultural humility. Great. And I'll say more about that in just a second. Briefly, that might kind of contextualize this. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to kind of like just this little picture is just kind of, I'm not going to talk this through, but this is just a quick summary, I gave these kind of the individual framing and then the systemic framing of these problems. And then for each of these, what I'm going to do now is go through an action that you could take to address these. So you can keep in mind as I'm going, like the ones that you were most interested in, and you can like think about how feasible these actions are for you. And also other actions you can take, because I don't want to claim to be, the sole authority on this. You all have your own expertise you're bringing in the room. That's part of why we're going to be doing the discussions, because, we certainly need more creative solutions to address these issues. And, you all are well positioned to come up with them. Okay, so again, I'm going to be going through each of these, so I'm not going to read them all right now. But overall, what I want to say first is that all of these solutions, what they're really doing is they're kind of working to reframe how we think about trust. In a lot of the literature we saw on diversifying clinical trials, there was an implicit question of how do we make the communities trust us? And that was kind of the goal, is like, how do we foster trust? And, without really, which sort of like almost as if it's a one-way thing. We just need to bring them into us. And at worst, it could even be in a sort of like coercive fashion. And this kind of aligns sometimes with like moving to this general idea of like having, cultural awareness and sensitivity. If we just show that we know where they're coming from, like they'll trust us. So instead of asking that question, one question we could ask instead is, are we trustworthy? And being really honest and reflective, and really asking, do I have the cultural competencies to really be asked for it to be a fair ask of people to say to trust me, because it may not be. Again, based on our own lived experience, our own, work that we've done, both on our own sort of recognition of our own perceptions and biases, and also just, like the types of knowledge that we have. And then finally, we can, even after that, we can also ask this question, are we trusting them? Because ultimately, trust develops best when a person feels that they're trusted. If I'm working with someone and I don't feel like they trust me, I am very unlikely to trust them. And oftentimes, the ways that medical interventions have historically been framed, we're not showing that we trust the community. We are actually saying in many cases, oh, let me just explain it to you so you get it. We don't actually trust that you know everything, that you can actually take care of your own health, which is a very, which is a logic that is based in colonialist rhetoric. It's very demeaning. It's kind of dehumanizing. It's not really, giving people credit that they very much deserve. And so instead we can think, how are we trusting them? How can we demonstrate that we believe that they know what is best for their own health? And if they know that, we need to walk in with humility, because what that means is that maybe I, as the researcher, don't know everything that I thought I did. Maybe I'm here and I'm going to learn something new. Also acknowledge that a lot of everything I've been saying, there is this implicit sort of like us versus them, like us, the researchers, versus them, the community. And that's like a distinction that I'm very grateful to say is getting disrupted, as we're seeing people coming from different life experiences entering into medical research. And so, if as I'm talking, you're kind of like, okay, well, like this, I don't actually feel I have these attitudes that you're talking about, like the logics you're kind of saying around systemic deficit makes sense to me. I want to acknowledge that and say, like, that is fantastic. And you are exactly like who we need in these spaces, who is actually like, has a lived experience of the knowledge that of historic and ongoing inequity, while also understanding the logics of research and recognizing both its strengths and what it can do really wonderfully, and places where change is needed. Okay, so now I'm kind of going to go through those like actions. And so kind of like as I'm going, you can kind of like jot down the ones that you're most interested in, because I'll be asking a question about that at the end before we go into discussion. So, as I said before, one way we can think about trust is that this like individual or community like predisposition. And that's what we want to move away from. And instead, we want to move towards thinking about trust as a two-way process. Again, something like, in order for us to gain trust, we actually have to not only move in good faith, but we also have to show trust in communities. One way that we can do that is by learning about the histories of abuse, discrimination, and exclusion in medicine, and secondly, the community responses to that. How have communities actually like operated without access to not just cutting edge research, but sometimes basic medical care. A great example of this is one of the often unacknowledged like innovators in public health were the Black Panthers and the work that they were doing in the Bay Area in order to provide public access to healthcare to their community. And this was a direct response to these histories of discrimination. It was a community-based solution. So sort of like what solutions have they come up with already on their own? And how can we respect that? This is an example of like, how can we trust the community? What action can we take if we're moving from this framework of communities being hard to reach to seeing research as something that's being hard to reach? How do we do that? Well, we as researchers become available. This may mean learning about local health organizations, volunteering, or seeing how you can get involved in local FQHCs, federally qualified healthcare clinics, or community clinics. It may mean forming relationships with them. One of just like the sort of like, I feel like resources that we really need to connect with and honor are in many of our healthcare clinics in California are the promotoras de salud, these health promoters who are often often women in the community who are the sort of like frontline workers. They're working to do that sort of like public health outreach and connection that brings people into healthcare clinics that might otherwise not be there. Learn from them, see them as our teachers. And we can also learn from health justice organizations. There's some really amazing organizations out there. We'll be sharing those via email in a bit. But there's lots of places where we can learn and we can kind of like be present, physically or virtually present, in a way that then that immediately makes research more accessible. Okay, so what is the action that we take if we're moving from a research-centric approach to connection, which often has to do again with outreach and education, to a more community-centric framework, which we see as doing the work in order to get a proper invitation into that community? How do we properly invite people, one, into a space that we make, or properly work in order to get an invitation into their space? Well, what does this take? One, this takes resources. And in other words, this isn't something that happens for free. If you're writing grants, or in the future, if you're writing grants, this is something that you need to really build into your budget. It's also important that we're transparent. Sometimes when we're coming in, it's not good to just say, oh, I can do anything. Really recognize, like, what are the constrictions you're working under? What can't you do? And be real about that and transparent with the community. Make sure that you're addressing history. Are there any local histories with the medical systems where you're working? Can you learn those ahead of time and walk into the room informed? That will really help. And really think about power imbalances. We can't necessarily undo power imbalances. So that sort of is like a, I'd say false goal. Be great, but we can't undo a structure where like one person may systemically have more power than the other. But what we can do is we can acknowledge them, we can address them, we can think about how we can sort of like work to shift them in a particular situation. And all these things can help to create a deeper sense of relationship and connection with a community that you may want to work in your research. Okay, so if we're moving from, what actions do we take if we're moving from a model of the traditional individual consent to a more robust form of consent? One option is we can think about what it looks like to have community consent. So if we've developed these relationships, then we have the opportunity to think about how can we design research with communities and how can we honor community expertise? Maybe this changes the way we ask our research questions. Maybe it changes the way we do our methods, or the way that we the way that we decide to write up results. But regardless, if we can develop our research protocols with community, then we are actually getting community consent ahead of time. Of course, we still get that individual consent, but if we have a community signing on ahead of time and being like, yeah, this is a good project, say with a particular FQHC, for example, or a network of them, who knows, then we're much more likely to have really solid recruitment as that project gets going. Now, what does it look like to take action if we're moving from this model that, communities need outreach to something different? What it looks like is, having this humility where we're learning from communities, we're respecting community priorities, kind of just reinforcing what I've been saying here in the past 2 slides. I'm kind of getting close to wrapping up here. I wanted to include this really great quote. This is from a promotora de salud at the Winters Healthcare Clinic. She's shared with us, we interviewed her when we were forming this training, and she said, "La confianza es la base. Communities will open up to you if you take the time to visit and listen to them, if you take the time to make connections and let yourself be known. La comunidad will also open up if you pour your heart into them." And so this is someone, that's worked, front lines healthcare in this, it's, historically farming town, working with many farm laborers, saying, and she's been working for decades, this is what's needed. If you really want to connect, if you really want your research to benefit these people, this is what you need to do. Okay, so this will be our last poll before we go into discussions. So I've given you a number of actions and you can choose more than one. I'm curious to hear what actions you think you are most likely to take. And this again will kind of like help to direct, where your discussions may go. So it could be learning about injustices and exclusions in your research field. It could be following a health organization in order to learn their critiques and solutions. So this is like both like what have the problems been and what have been the solutions they've found. It may be to reflect on your own position and how where you're coming from might shape recruitment. It may be connecting with community organizations. It may be volunteering or, finding ways to participate with the FQHC or community health clinic. It may be letting this information inform your future research designs. Many of you are kind of moving towards becoming a PI in your own right, or maybe some of you already been there. So you'll have the opportunity to kind of like be the leader. And the last one, engage in reflection and conversation on biases in your field. So just having these conversations will, I truly believe, lead to these other transformations, because if we really think about it, it's hard not to act. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll here, show what y'all said. So we can see that it looks like, a lot of you were interested in this, reflection conversation. I think that's fantastic. I think the more people we have talking around this, the better results we're going to get. 6 out of 9 of you were interested in both letting this inform your future research design. That's brilliant. And connecting with community organizations. Those feel very linked to me. 5 out of 9 of you wanted to learn more about the injustices and exclusions in your field. That connects really well with, engaging in conversation and reflection. I know a lot of your fields do journal clubs and things like that. So there's opportunities there. And then 3 out of 9 of you were interested in following a health justice organization and reflecting on your own position. That's wonderful. And, one of you right now is considering volunteering time. That's great. Wonderful. Oh, I'm so sorry. I went through all those and I didn't share them. I'll keep those up for a minute so you can kind of look through it on your own. So now we're going to be moving into discussion. We'll be putting you all in 2 breakout groups, and you're going to get a chance to answer these questions. The first one is, how do you see the risks and benefits of current research allocated? What barriers do you think are, so that question is sort of like, kind of the most obvious example is the difference between phase 1 and phase 3, but also thinking more broadly. I mean, who kind of gets the benefits of the latest health innovations? If you are struggling to get basic health needs met, why would you possibly, are you going to benefit from some cutting edge technology? Likely, probably not. So why would you want to contribute to its its creation? That's a valid question. What barriers do you think are most significant to increasing racial diversity in clinical trials? And then what actions can researchers take to increase trustworthiness? So those two, you can kind of think about like those poll questions we asked. And then are there any actions that you could start implementing now? I really like to encourage people after these trainings to think about what's something you can do like in the next few months to kind of keep some momentum going around exploring these questions.